The world has marked International Anti-Corruption Day, and to coincide with this, the Human Sciences Research Council has released a study on corruption and behavior change, where they track social norms and values in the country, looking at how to create a culture of zero tolerance for corruption inside South African society. Let's talk about this with Dr. Stephen Gordon, who is a senior research specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council. Good morning and welcome to the program. Thanks as always for your time, and also thanks for sharing the results of the study and also what's going to happen in future, in trying to understand at the core why we still see issues of corruption being so endemic in a country like South Africa. I want to perhaps kick off, if we can, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy 2020 to 2030 is a whole-of-society approach to combat corruption. We know that that's what's needed. But more detailed anti-corruption programs are needed, the HSRC says, to be able to pinpoint and be more intentional about this. And this is why you're embarking also on a multi-year study which will home in on corruption and behavior change. Perhaps as an opener, just tell us about that.
Absolutely. So the Human Science Research Council is conducting a multi-year study, as you have said, trying to understand corruption at the street level. So we have been talking to ordinary people about their experiences of corruption, about their attitudes towards corruption, and how they can fight corruption. When we talk about a whole of society approach, as you have said, this means enlisting the help of citizens in the fight against corruption. So while a lot is being done in terms of fighting corruption at the top national level in the halls of government, we also want to understand how we can get ordinary citizens to help participate in the fight against corruption. So how can we encourage them to report corruption when they see and witness it? So we have been looking very intensely at what are some of the drivers behind that type of information. In addition, we talked to a range of experts from across many different disciplines to really understand the root causes of this problem, what drives corruption, and what are the best solutions to helping address it.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that piece insofar as it involves what we would say are, ordinary, everyday people. But I want to go to just some of the sentiments that you've revealed through your conversations with people and their sense of what corruption is and who's implicated in it. 79% of the general public says corruption has a large impact on the general economy of the country. And that would, I suppose, Stephen, be borne out by the experiences of a lack of service delivery, for example, directly related to corrupt activities. Talk to us about some of the other sentiments that you've managed to divine through the survey and how people see public officials.
Absolutely. So we found that the majority of the public think that corruption has had a large impact in the economy and on state-owned enterprises. But more seriously and more depressingly, we have seen that 64% of the adult population said that corruption had a large impact on themselves and their family. We looked at bribe solicitation from public officials, and we found that the share of the general public reporting experiencing bribe solicitation from public officials has gone up since we first started asking these questions in 2006. Many South Africans are very worried about corruption amongst elites, especially political elites. And there's a lot of concern that the law and law enforcement and the legal system are not doing enough to address corruption. We found that 62% of the general public thought that government efforts to combat corruption were not effective. We found that 46% thought that ordinary people will not be punished by the authorities for engaging in corruption, and 63% said that elites will not be punished by the authorities for engaging in corruption.
I mean, those are disturbing enough as they stand, particularly that one where the majority of the public believes that anything that government's doing to combat corruption is not going to be effective. There's a pervasive picture as well, sentiment around public officials. 84% of people believing that almost all politicians are involved in corrupt behavior, and there's an insidious piece around 38% of the general public believing that sexual extortion is happening in the public sector. And read together with South Africa's dismal culture of violence against women and children, there's a really, really toxic mix. Okay, so in a sense, we've managed to put the things out into the sunlight. Now we need to disinfect all of this and see, well, what can we do next? Given that people believe that government programs and government interventions to fix this and reverse this are ineffective and aren't going to work, what should the next step be? Is this only a sentiment issue, or is it borne out by facts, by evidence?
Well, firstly, we must be aware that if the public distrusts key institutions tasked with fighting corruption, that distrust will make it more difficult for those institutions to fight corruption. But obviously, we see a lot of appetite for reducing corruption and a sense that corruption is not a good thing in our society. So what we need to do is we need to rebuild public trust in the legal system and in law enforcement agencies. This means tackling perceptions of inefficiency in public responses to corruption and safeguarding whistleblowers. You know, a majority of South Africans, 62%, say they live in a community where they are afraid to speak out against corruption for fear of reprisal. So we need to make people feel safe. So we need to enhance whistleblower protections. You know, obviously, there are a lot of good work that's been done by our anti-corruption agencies in South Africa. So we need to publicize this good work so that people feel that progress has been made. Yeah. Obviously, as you know, today there is a move to create new agencies to more aggressively tackle corruption in South Africa. So those need to be given the adequate resources and political will to see them succeed. I know that the Zondo Commission has suggested a series of reforms and recommendations regarding political oversights around corruption. These also need to be given due consideration. Also, we need to popularize and inform people about the various anonymous forms of reporting corruption, because those do exist. Many people, however, because they do not trust the legal system to fight corruption, are not using them as they should.
Right.
By strengthening these mechanisms, I feel people will feel that they can make a difference in the fight against corruption, will be more eager to fight corruption and more eager to work with the states against this terrible problem in our society.
So, Dr. Stephen Gordon, on the one side is that, and the other side is people, right? How do we create a culture of genuine zero tolerance for crime and corruption? We know, and you've said, you know, states and public institutions, and as we've seen variously corrupt, either corrupt or ineffective. So people convince themselves that finding their own ways to solve problems is best, and sometimes that solve may include bending or breaking the rules. I'm sure we've all been in conversations where somebody would have, been over the limit, for example, and then said, we will just give, the person who's pulling us over some money. Or if they go to a public institution, they might pay or be tempted to pay an official to solve a problem for them. So, it's kind of that broken window syndrome.
So we talked to a lot of experts about what drives corruption. So we really wanted to engage with the systematic and environmental factors driving corruption. And it's very important to consider that there are strong survivalist pressures that cause ordinary people trying to navigate sometimes institutions which can be dishonest, sometimes these institutions can be dysfunctional, and there's a lot of pressure to engage in forms of petty corruption just to make your way in this challenging and difficult economy nation that we call South Africa. So we need to recognize these survivalist pressures, this needs-based corruption. the goal isn't to demonize particularly the poor and the working class for engaging in acts of petty corruption, but rather to fix the institutional dysfunction that sometimes can force people or pressure people to engage in these types of corruption. So what we need is institutional strengthening, more greater honesty and integrity within our institutions. And this will allow us to fight corruption. In addition, I think we must also remember that sometimes when people think about whether corruption can be tolerable, can be acceptable, they do not have a strong sense of civic patriotism, a belief and adherence to the principles of equality, justice, and equity enshrined in our Constitution. We need to do more to promote this type of civic patriotism, which is different from a simple blind loyalty to the rules, authority, or the nation, but a comprehensive adherence to constitutional principles, which I feel is sometimes too lacking in our country today.
Yeah, it needs to be more in the public discourse, that philosophical, moral, civic duty oriented discussion. Thanks for your thoughts, by the way, and for sharing with us the merits of the study so far. Dr. Stephen Gordon, who is Senior Research Specialist at the Human Science Research Council. We're loading